Hey art nerds, I have an art tutorial for you guys today. We're going to be painting this Lilliputian merchant with her tortoise mount, and we're going to be using just kind of my daily driver watercolor palette that includes Winsor Newton, Holbein, Daniel Smith, Sennelier, and M. Graham, so it's quite a mix. I have a video where I talk about that a little bit more that I'll link you guys in the description below. I am also using a variety of brushes, but I am going to be using my silver black velvet brushes the most. So we're going to start by stretching our watercolor illustration. This was originally printed using blue lines on Stonehenge's Aqua cold press watercolor paper. I have a tutorial on how to do that, as well as a review of the paper comparing it to the hot press. You guys can find that down in the description below. And I inked it with a Sakura Pigma FB. These are waterproof brush pens. I love using them for my illustration. To stretch my watercolor paper, I'm using a piece of corrugated plastic. I saturate the back. I wipe that down. I wipe off the excess water using some Viva paper towels, flip it over, saturate the front to activate the blue lines. Since the blue lines on this one had sat around for a while, they've gotten pretty embedded in the paper, but I'm not super concerned about that. I saturate it again, wipe off the excess, and then I use 3M's crepe blue painter's tape to stretch it. And I have stretching tutorials here on the channel, but as well as over on the blog. So I allow it to dry fully, in fact so fully that it dried for several months before I could get back to it. And now I'm applying a loose wash of a very cool yellow. I believe it's like one of the Sennelier yellow Azos or Sennelier yellow, I'm not sure which one exactly, and I'm just kind of dabbing off some of the extra and then flicking some of that same yellow onto it. Now it's actually wrong, I just remembered what I'm using. It is India yellow. So what I like about this color is that it's got a lot of range. It can go from almost cool when it's very desaturated to very warm and golden. So once the background kind of had a chance to soak in, I start painting in the base on the tortoise. And as I'm painting this tortoise, I am referencing images from Google image search. So referencing can be a wonderful tool to help you accurately paint your subjects. I'm using the same Indian yellow since many tortoises have almost kind of a golden color as the undertone for their shells. And then at the top, I'm kind of blocking things in using some Payne's Gray. I'm basically doing an underpainting with the Payne's Gray to help establish my shadows on the tortoise's load early on. And this illustration is from my 2017 Inktober zine, Lilliputian Living Volume 1. In the future, I will not be doing Inktober. I'm going to be doing something else in October, and I would recommend those of you who are curious about what's going on with that to look it up. But it is a trademark property now, so I will be spending my time working on other projects rather than using that name. But so this was originally drawn and inked in a Strathmore Visual Arts journal, but I liked the illustration. I wanted to watercolor it, so I transferred it onto a different sheet of paper. And now I'm just kind of painting in the base skin tone for the girl using, I believe it is M. Graham's Burnt Umber, but it might be Raw Umber. I apologize. So for the most part, I'm going to be working with the largest brushes that I'm comfortable using. So I'm going to be using a lot of the silver black velvet brushes. Those are a combination of synthetic and squirrel. I really like them. I think they're good workhorse brushes. And this illustration is going to have a lot of just layering, glazing, and going over areas, developing areas. So if you're interested in learning the very basics of watercolor, I have a series, Watercolor Basics, that will help you out. I also have a series of quick and easy watercolor tutorials if you're just starting out and you want a few easy wins under your belt, or you would like to understand watercolor techniques a little bit better. Generally, my watercolor is for comics. I paint a watercolor comic, 7-inch Cara. You guys can read that for free at 7inchcara.com. And I have a few tutorials here on the channel where I show you guys how to paint watercolor comics as well. So for the ground, I applied kind of a light layer, a light mix of Payne's Gray, and while it's still wet, I'm dabbing in a heavier mix of Payne's Gray. And then I'm going to go back up into the tortoise's load and add some more shadows and further refine those and add definition. So I gave the shadows on the tortoise's pack a few layers just to help me build up that definition. Since the things that are going to be in that pack are going to be multicolored, it's really easy to establish my shadows now rather than trying to unify my shadows later. And I'm working with a thicker mix of the brown for her skin tone. And I'm also starting to paint that in at the bottom for the dirt beneath the tortoise. At this point, I'm also painting in some blush on her cheeks, under her neck, on the palms of her hands. And I talk about this a little bit more in some of my other watercolor tutorials, and I talk about this a lot in my Copic marker tutorials, where for people with darker skin tones, it's often helpful to establish the blush and the shadows early on rather than trying to glaze those on top of several layers of color. And for the tortoise, I'm starting to block in the color and working wet into wet. I add some Van Dyke Brown. So I used Van Dyke Brown, a very light wash of that for the base, and I'm kind of working in sections so I can catch the paper while it's still wet. Then I apply another wash of it and I add in my wet into wet shadows there too. So I've painted on Stonehenge cold press watercolor paper several times, and I don't know that if you guys will be able to tell, but I did kind of struggle with some fuzziness and some bleeding in this instance, and this is a new occurrence of the problem. And part of me wonders if perhaps it was because I'd waited a really long time between stretching the paper and painting it. It may have accumulated some dust that I wasn't able to brush off, or it may be due to the fact that Nashville's undergoing several severe weather changes at this point in time. It's been really hot, it's been really rainy, and today it's snowing. So all of that can cause irregularities in how watercolor paper handles. So for the shell, I am brushing in another wash of, it looks like a very light wash of the Van Dyke Brown, and I'm kind of dabbing some of it up with a paper towel, and then I'm trying to brush in some darker color wet into wet. If you guys look up tortoises, you may notice that the tortoiseshell pattern on the back of tortoises tends to be hexagonal or triangular in shape depending on the tortoise. So I was trying to recreate that without being too obvious and too structured in how I did it. I've been trying to work a little bit more loosely, and having the tortoise kind of gives me an opportunity to paint something that's a little more loose and a little less sort of paint by numbers, fill in the blanks. So once the tortoise has had a chance to dry a little bit, I go in and I add some more shadows, this time using a mix of naphthalide maroon and purple to paint in shadows on our merchant girl. And then I also use this as an opportunity to refine some of the shadows on the tortoise. And that jingling sound you heard was Bowie hopping into my lap for some cuddles. He'd like me to remind you guys that if you enjoy the work that I do here on YouTube and you'd like to help support it, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup, or you can send me a one-time tip via Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/natosoup. And supporting the work that I do, supporting the free art education that I put out there, helps me buy him his very expensive cat food and pay for his vet bills. So he would greatly appreciate it, although he will not meow for you. I don't know why. And when those shadows had a chance to dry, I'm going in and I'm adding another layer of our brown mix. This time I've started mixing in some of the Van Dyke Brown. And I really like using Van Dyke Brown because it's a warm, sort of rich brown, kind of like Indian yellow. It tends to shade a lot, so you can get a lot out of just layering Van Dyke Brown over and over again. It has a lot of versatility. I'm also using the Payne's Gray to start establishing some of the shadows on her clothing. Ah, there's Bo. And I haven't quite decided yet what colors I want her to wear. So by doing an underglaze with the Payne's Gray to kind of establish the shadows, it starts beginning to, or it helps me allow to start developing form. So after adding another layer of blush to her cheeks, I'm going to start painting the blueberry that she's offering her tortoise friend, and I'm using Naphthalide Maroon for that. And I decided to use the same color. It's one of my favorite colors. It's a really rich, warm, cooler red to begin painting in her sort of pantaloons. And I added some additional shadows with the same color while it was still wet into wet so that we could get a diffuse blend. For her top, I'm going to go ahead and use the Indian Yellow again, since it's such a lovely color and it's reflected in the tortoise's shell. Thought it could give us some color consistency without being too samey. And to kind of pop things out, I'm using a really beautiful Sennelier Ultramarine Blue for her headband. Once that had a chance to dry a bit, I'm going in with another layer of shadow of Naphthalide Maroon on her pants. And you guys can kind of see where it bled out towards the top. That's what I mean by the paper has been kind of weird and bleedy tonight. Also want to point out, this video has been time-lapsed about 4 times. Overall, this took 3 days of painting, maybe 8 hours total if we're just talking active painting time. So I don't want to give you guys the indication or the implication that art is a quick thing. Art can be sometimes a very slow thing. It's okay. It takes the time it takes. Don't try to rush things. Try to give things as much time as they need to develop. This also means that for 2 evenings, I let this piece sit overnight. This is a good thing on many levels. It gives it a chance. Yes, Bowie. It gives it a chance to fully dry out. It gives me a chance to kind of see what the colors are going to be more accurately. Once they dry, they tend to dry lighter. And it also gives my brain a chance to rest, and it gives me a chance to problem solve as I sleep. So now that I've kind of blocked in what's going on with her, I can start blocking in the objects in the pack. And since this is kind of a slow dry night tonight, it takes a little bit longer, and I'm not painting any objects that are adjacent to one another right now. And this allows me to work a little bit faster because while some objects dry, I can paint other non-adjacent objects. If you try to paint objects that are next to each other, especially if they're different colors, while it's still wet, they're going to bleed into each other. And sometimes that's a look you want, that's a technique you want, but you should be deliberate with it. It's better to just kind of skip around and paint different things, block in different things, than have a mess that you need to figure out how to clean up. So for the sugar cube bag, I did a really light wash of ultramarine blue, and then I basically just kind of blocked in the shadow areas, and this gives us it gives us the idea of transparency. It makes the bag seem like it's transparent plastic. Now for her boots, I kind of struggled with what I wanted to do with them. Normally for Lilliputians, I would give them sort of more natural colors, earth tones. But the tortoise himself is so earthy already, so much brown. I decided I wanted to go with black for her boots just to have a little bit more contrast going on. So I've already painted in the little yellow sort of flowers on the fabric in the background. I allowed that to dry, and now I'm painting around it using purple. Another technique you could use for this is to mask off those areas. Go ahead and paint your purple, that would be much quicker, and then go in and paint your yellows. And I could have also masked off the rope that's holding everything to the tortoise However, I was having a lot of problems, as I said earlier, with this paper, and sometimes masking fluid can have unexpected effects. It can tear up your paper if you're painting under unusual atmospheric circumstances, so I decided not to risk it, and I decided to just be really careful. Now, since I'm recording this for you guys, it does have me at a bit of a limitation. I frequently have this propped up a couple of inches using just some art supplies that I have on the table. Generally, if I were not recording, I would sit on the floor and I would be painting this kind of in my lap, propping it up and able to get really close to it. That's generally my preferred method of painting, but since I'm recording it, I'm kind of limited to my desktop. I can't move it around a whole lot, so I'm not able to get the best angle possible for myself because I'd like to keep it static for you so you guys can easily follow what I'm doing. And it also means I can't jam my head on up in there so I can see what I'm doing. So sometimes my tutorials, sometimes when I walk you guys through things, it's not necessarily what I would do if I were just painting for me. And I try to disclose that for you guys because I feel like it's important to find the methods and the situations that work best for you as an artist. Don't try to necessarily emulate everything somebody else does. Find what you like. Color theory, especially when I'm painting kind of a motley assortment of items, is not always my strongest point. So one of the things I do to kind of help offset that is I try to repeat some of the same colors over and over again. For this piece, though, I wanted to keep sort of the focal point objects and the objects closer to us bright, warm colors. So the blanket on top with the tassels is yellow with orange tassels on it. The pocket knife is a bright red. Some of the candies are peppermint, so they're red and white. And then we have an orange candy in the front. And then receding towards the back, we have blues, greens, purples, and even a brown. And hopefully this gives kind of a sense of depth by having the darker colors as the background or shadowed objects and having the brighter colors closer to the viewer or on top of things where they might catch more light or as sort of little focus or points of interest. So for her black boots, I built up a lot of layers of Payne's gray, and I also worked wet into wet, and I also picked up some of the color while the color was still wet using a paper towel, because I wanted to give it kind of a worn and more mottled effect, a more scuffed effect. I didn't want them to be like brand new, bright, shiny boots that she polished, because this is a woman who travels. This is somebody who's out in the open a lot, a very utilitarian sort of person. And considering the fact that her tortoise is carrying most of the load, she's probably doing a lot of walking beside him, leading him. So I wanted the boots to be a little bit more practical. When you're creating an illustration like this, it's really important to think about storytelling. I did a lot of the storytelling work when I was first sketching and inking this illustration a couple years ago, but I wanted to continue the storytelling work with my watercolor. So right now, the reds in this image are a little bit pink for me. I used cherry red, Holbein cherry red, which is a quinacridone red. So I want to kind of develop those colors a little bit more by layering on alizarin crimson and naphthalide maroon, which are much cooler reds, which are going to kind of tone down that candy color a little bit. So hopefully you guys can see that I'm kind of working on everything in stages. I'm trying not to render any one object or person too much. And part of this is just to kind of prevent mistakes from happening, like bleeding, like running, like colors reactivating if I don't want them to. And part of this is also just for consistency's sake to try and make sure that the whole piece looks finished rather than just individual pieces parts. So for her hair, I wanted to go with kind of a dark brownish black, and I kind of saved that towards the end. That's just generally my process when I'm painting people, is I try to get the face rendered first before I go in and start really working the hair. So we're beginning with kind of light washes of Van Dyke Brown mixed with sepia, and that's just to kind of set the highlights, determine what the highlights are going to be, because I don't want the highlights to be just white. You could do just white, that would be very shiny hair. I want them to be kind of white and brown to indicate kind of a richness of color to her hair. So since everything's kind of blocked in, I've been progressively working towards smaller watercolor brushes. When I'm working with smaller watercolor brushes, I prefer to work with natural fiber squirrel and Kolinsky sable. They are less prone to kind of scraping the color off of the page, so they're very useful for glazing and for shadows. If I were doing details with really thick mixes, dry over wet or dry over dry, I might go with a synthetic because it's going to have the rigidity to kind of stand up to what I'm doing. And I'm going in with a small Kolinsky brush and filling in her hair. Again, this time trying to leave a bit of the earlier layers still visible to help develop contrast. And you guys might notice I'm trying to be deliberate with my mark making. I'm not just filling in her hair, I'm kind of doing these curved C-shaped brush strokes to kind of imply that she has curly, bouncy hair. And when that dried, I went in with a much thicker mix of sepia mixed with black. And for the most part, I'm just kind of picking at details here and there, adding some shadow, either using the main color itself, but in a much more saturated form, or using a bit of Payne's gray, just to kind of add some coolness and some depth to give us more depth of field. And I'm waiting to start on the rope that holds the pack on, kind of until the end, just because I don't want to. If I make a mistake when I'm painting, which is very likely when I'm painting like this, I can't see what I'm doing very well. It's easier to clean that up later than to have painted the rope and then try to clean that up. That's more difficult. And it's also just kind of generally easier for me since it's a smaller detail that would require a thicker mix. So at this point, I kind of want to break up what's going on the ground. So I am adding a few darker shadows just to add more contrast. And then I'm flicking some of the dark brown just kind of around the bottom just to kind of break it up since we have that spray kind of going on around the top. The whole time I was painting this piece, I couldn't decide if I wanted the bells to be brass bells, which would be like a yellow color, or silver bells. I decided to go with silver bells because there's so much yellow and brown in the tortoise. I wanted the bells to stand out a little bit more, so I decided to go with Payne's Gray as our silver base. And they ended up getting a little bit darker than I really wanted. I could have lifted that up very easily by applying water and dabbing that back out with a paper towel. For the beads around the tortoise's neck, that kind of implies that he's beloved by the merchant. You know, they work together. She cares about him. I decided to go with beads that kind of matched her outfit, but also contrasted with the colors that we used on the tortoise. And I also kind of broke up the ultramarine blue beads at the bottom with a couple of yellow beads here and there just to kind of tie in with the main color scheme and also to kind of break up the blue so it's not just like monotonous blue beads. For the bells, I did a little bit of wet into wet blending just to kind of soften the transition between the shades of silver. So I'd figured for a while that the rope I was going to use, it was going to be like a yellow ochre or a natural twine rope. That seems very fitting for a Lilliputian who often has to make or steal most of what they have. I could have done a contrasting color like a red that might have drawn more attention to it, but I think going with the yellow ochre was a good choice just because that's what we normally think of when we think of like twine. And I added a darker mix of the yellow ochre kind of towards where we reach the knot and where the knot overlaps itself to create shadow. And I also added a bit of old Daniel Smith Quinn gold just to kind of develop the shadows on the rope a bit more without desaturating it too much. Once everything had a chance to dry, I busted out my Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils, or they're not really watercolor pencils, but let's call them watercolor pencils just for brevity's sake. I've reviewed a lot of watercolor pencils recently, and those tutorials will be coming out to the public in the future, but my Artnerds on Patreon have already had them for a couple of months, and I have to say that the Derwent Inktense are still some of my favorite water-soluble pencils that can be used as watercolor pencils. For this illustration, I'm really just using indigo and white just to add some shadows, kind of tie everything together, and then add some white highlights here and there. The Stonehenge Aqua cold press has a really nice texture that plays really well with watercolor pencils. I also added a little bit of white gouache to my Teflon craft sheet, and I'm mixing in just a little bit of water until we have kind of a heavy cream consistency. And I'm using this to paint in some white highlights as well, just to kind of clean up the focus, clean up the details, and just to add some more contrast here and there, particularly to her hair and to metal objects. Finally, we're removing our finished watercolor illustration once it's had a chance to dry fully from the stretcher board. This has been on the stretcher board for about 4 months now, so the tape really doesn't want to peel off. When you peel the tape away, you want to peel away at a 90-degree angle, and this is going to prevent it from tearing into your illustration. If the paper tears, it's going to tear where the tape was or tear outside of your illustration, so you're way less likely to ruin your art this way. I have used watercolor tape in the past. It's meant to be cut off rather than removed, so I find blue painter's tape to be the best solution for this. And we have our finished illustration. This is the third. So the first was the Bunny Rancher, then there was the Lilliputian Messenger, and now we have the Merchant and her tortoise. If you guys are interested in reading about these guys, you guys can purchase Lilliputian Living Volume 1 on my Gumroad. I'll put a link down in the description below. We have 3 volumes out now. You can also get it for free if you're one of my amazing, wonderful, phenomenal patrons on Patreon. I want to thank you guys so much for your support, and Bowie would like to thank you for your support as well. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful, useful, and informative. I have loads of great watercolor tutorials, reviews, and walkthroughs here on this channel, as well as over on my blog at natosoup.blogspot.com.